Hello, in this section we're going to look at flows and energy of matter. Or more precisely, we're going to look at it in two parts. In the first part we'll look at flows of energy, and then in the second part is a separate video, we'll look at flows of matter through ecosystems. So let's start by having a look at the main ideas. Well, our first main idea is that ecosystems are linked together by energy and matter flows. Ecosystems are not in isolation from themselves. They border other ecosystems, and energy and matter flow backwards and forwards across the borders of ecosystems. And the most important thing we're really going to look at is that the sun's energy drives all these flows. And within the flows, humans are impacting on the flows of both energy and matter at a global level and a local level. So let's start off with actually looking at what we really mean by energy and ecosystem. So all of the energy that drives all of the processes on the planet starts off as solar radiation. However, not all of the solar radiation ends up being used in ecosystem processes. Quite a lot of the energy that enters the atmosphere is either reflected back into the atmosphere or is absorbed by surfaces where it can't actually be used by the ecosystem itself. So we've got absorption by ozone, water vapor, carbon dioxide, ice, dust and surfaces at ground level. Now some of those surfaces are plants, and when the energy is being absorbed by plants, that's when it becomes useful energy to the ecosystem. It's energy that's then available to do work. The total amount of absorption, though, of solar radiation is about 69%. But we also have this reflection, energy that's reflected straight back out from the atmosphere. And that's being reflected off all sorts of surfaces. Water vapor, surfaces at the ground level, and clouds, and the atmosphere itself. And that accounts for about 31% of the energy. However, as we already know from earlier in the course, the amount of solar radiation entering the planet is not the same everywhere. At the poles, the sun's energy is spread out much more, and in the equator is much more concentrated. That alters the amount of energy that's available for ecosystems, and actually is in some ways the defining component of what allows different types of ecosystems to exist. So all this is linked very directly to the laws of thermodynamics. And if you remember the laws of thermodynamics, we looked at those in topic 1. So let's go through this sort of stepwise. So solar radiation, when it comes in, is absorbed by plants in photosynthesis. It gets converted into sugars and is stored. So that's the storage of chemical energy. To be of use to the ecosystem, that is then eaten by consumers, herbivores, and that again becomes a stored source of energy. And it's a stored source of energy for the next level, for carnivores. So we have the development of food chains where energy is passed along the food chains from its original form as sunlight to chemical energy in terms of the biomass, in terms of the material of each of those organisms, which is then eaten by another organism. And that is very much the first law of thermodynamics. No energy is being created in this, nor has energy been destroyed in the food chain. It's only moved or changed form. However, that's not the only fate of energy within an ecosystem. So some of the energy that's absorbed by plants then is actually used for work and is re-released as heat within respiration. And that happens at every level of the food chain. So as we move through the food chain, the energy is being spread out. Not all of the useful energy is being passed from one trophic level to the next trophic level. We've got a loss of energy from the system to the atmosphere in the terms of heat. So energy conversion is never efficient, and the longer the food chain, the more inefficient it becomes. That helps to explain why there are fewer top predators, carnivores, than there are herbivores, for instance, and explains why food chains are relatively short and can't really be more on land than about 4 organisms, and in the sea usually about 5 organisms. Now that's related directly to the second law of thermodynamics. And if you remember back, second law of thermodynamics states that entropy in an isolated system, not in equilibrium, will tend to increase over time. What that means is that the energy is spread out into different forms and lost as useful energy from the system. Okay, so that's linking it back to the laws of thermodynamics. But let's sort of summarize this a little bit better. So the first thing is that we have pathways. And first of all, we have the conversion of light energy to chemical energy. The chemical energy is then transferred from one trophic level to another, and we have different efficiencies of transfer within that. And so overall we have the conversion of light in the ecosystem eventually to heat in respiration. Eventually all of the energy that comes in as light becomes heat of respiration. Generally in the decomposition ecosystem, so decomposers and detrivores actually break down the products in the end and release the final amounts of energy back to the atmosphere as respiration. And so this is re-radiated as heat back into the atmosphere. However, during that, there are times when energy is converted into biomass, and we term the conversion of energy coming into a system into biomass in a given time period as productivity. We can talk about how productive a system is. So what we're really going to do in the rest of this is look at that idea of productivity. That's what we're really talking about when we're talking about energy flows. How does energy become productive and useful? Okay, so really again we start off with plants, and plants fix sunlight in photosynthesis. And they convert it into sugars. We call this gross primary production. The idea of gross, the maximum, and primary at the start. So, and gross primary production has two fates. It can be used to become new biomass, new material, or it can be used for work purposes, for the energy that's used to power metabolism. And so this gross primary production forms the starting point for all the other trophic levels. Without gross primary production, we have no energy available to other trophic levels at all. However, gross primary production is not entirely used. If we go back to thinking about the second law of thermodynamics, we know we're losing some of the energy from the system in the terms of heat that's generated through respiration, through work processes being done. And the resultant energy that's left we class as net primary production. Yeah, so net primary production is gross primary production minus the energy that's lost from the system. Remember, the energy hasn't disappeared, it's only been lost from the system from gross primary production. And net primary production is the rate at which plants can accumulate dry mass or biomass. Yeah, this is usually measured in terms of kilograms per meter per year, or in terms of an energy value of kilojoules per meter per year. And if we can measure net primary production, it actually goes quite a long way to understanding the interactions of energy within an ecosystem. So let's summarize this. So the glucose produced in photosynthesis has two main fates. Some of the glucose is used for growth, maintenance, reproduction. Yeah, that's glucose of work. Yeah, and that creates heat, which is lost during the process of respiration. For the rest of the ecosystem, it's what happens to the rest of it, the net primary production, the biomass that is deposited in the plant that can become food for other parts of the ecosystem throughout trophic levels. However, let's go back to this again and think about this idea that the amount of sunlight entering the atmosphere across the planet is not exactly the same. So we actually have different net primary productivity rates in different parts of the planet. The graph here is actually showing what's happening in the northern hemisphere oceans, and we can see very, very much that the amount of productivity, and productivity in this case is in the terms of the biomass of phytoplankton, plant plankton. And we can see that in the polar seas there's a spike of productivity around July, that all of the productivity is in a very short period of the summer months. And that is obviously explained by the fact that the polar seas are so cold for most of the rest of the year. But that's also related to the fact that in the midsummer you have 24 hours of sunlight almost at the poles. So you get this massive spike in productivity, which also becomes the food then for organisms that feed. So for instance, whales migrate to polar seas in the summer because there's an abundance of phytoplankton and krill. If we look at the temperate seas, we can see we get two different areas. Yeah, we get a rather large growth in the spring and early summer, and then in the autumn. Whereas in the tropic levels, we actually have much lower productivity spread across the year. Partly this is because there's lower nutrient levels in the tropical oceans, but also because actually it's too hot. The very, very top areas of the water are actually too hot to support a lot of phytoplankton. So surprisingly, we actually have lower productivity in the sea in the tropical areas than we do in the temperate areas. Across the entire year, it's the temperate areas of the ocean that actually have the highest productivity rate, and this is related directly to incoming solar radiation. So what happens as we move up through the trophic levels? Well, biological communities are more than just plants. We also have the herbivores, the carnivores, and the detrivores. And productivity also occurs as secondary production. Yeah, so we have secondary producers. These are producers that are using primary production to convert it to a secondary production. Yeah. However, animals do not use all of the biomass they consume. Quite a lot of plant biomass is actually wasted as feces. So some of the biomass coming in, it actually can't be absorbed by metabolism and through the intestine and through digestion. So that's actually wasted as feces. So again, that's wasted from the system, and in this case it's wasted from the system of the rabbit, but that feces enters the decomposer system. So no energy is being lost from the overall ecosystem as a whole at the moment, but it just is lost from the system that is the rabbit itself in this. So gross production in animals equals the amount of biomass or energy that they've assimilated, the amount that's been absorbed by their system, and that biomass is less the feces that have been passed through. However, we can term that as gross secondary production. So it's really what we're interested in is the amount of energy that's been assimilated, the amount of energy that's become new biomass, and this is secondary production. So secondary production fuses exactly the same equation. So net secondary production equals gross secondary production minus respiration. Now, in terms of this gross secondary production, we've got to do a little thought in this, because gross secondary production is food eaten minus the energy and feces that's passed. So we've got a slightly different term in how we think about production in terms of animals. Yeah. Now, understanding production in ecosystem is actually quite important for humans, because we actually exploit ecosystems. So we actually exploit ecosystems in lots of ways. If you think about it, a farm system is actually an ecosystem, and we're dealing with plants and animals, admittedly managed by humans, but we're still dealing with it. And possibly the best way to think about this is maybe to think about fishing. Quite often in fishing we talk about sustainable yield. How much fish can we catch without damaging the fish population? And we can think of that in terms of biomass. So sustainable yield is how much natural capital increases per year. So as long as we're only taking more natural capital than was in there in a system the year before, the system should continue to work. And the natural capital that we're always taking as humans is always going to be biomass. So fish are biomass. So, and this is the idea that a crop can be taken from an ecosystem. So the maximum sustainable yields are equivalent to the net primary or net secondary productivity of a system. Now, there's a model for this. There's actually a mathematical model for it, and I've laid it out here so you can see that in terms of the equation, we actually include the idea of total biomass. But in summarizing it, what we're looking at is something called annual growth and recruitment minus annual death and emigration. So these are the factors that actually affect the amount of biomass that there is. Yeah. Now, it works as an idea that as long as there's more new members of a population at the end of the year than at the beginning, we can exploit that extra. So sort of let's try and explain this in terms of a graph in a little bit more detail. So if we have a population in the first year, and think of this, that the population is biomass, and this is our population in the first year. In the second year, we have another population. The population's increased by that amount. as long as the population was sustainable in that first year and that population was healthy and could carry on reproducing at those rates continuously, what we could actually do is say that anything above the population of the first year is sustainable, and that it's actually surplus population to the system. So we could actually use that surplus, and we call that sustainable yield. Okay, so that was an introduction to energy flows and matter. Now, in the next section, we're going to look directly at what happens to matter itself. And biomass obviously becomes matter. And again, it's linked directly to biomass. So again, thanks a lot. This was the work that was cited. I only used one source this time, and there's no links for extended reading because those will be at the end of the next section. So look forward to you joining me for the next section, where we'll look at how energy is actually flowing, how energy becomes matter and matter flows through the system. So thanks a lot.